Chapter 9. Bhumika. Bhumika woke as the sky began to lighten, black softening to a dark hue of blue. She dressed in a plain white sari and bound beads of wood through her hair. The mahal was almost quiet, almost peaceful, but in the distance she could hear the hum of voices and knew that the worshippers were already gathering at the base of the Hirana, waiting to climb the mountain and make their offerings. Her crown mask lay swaddled in white cloth at her bedside. She unwrapped it with care, pushing back layers of fabric to bare the oval of wood. The hollowed sockets for eyes stared back at her. She cupped the shape of the mask in her palm, feeling the weight of it, the smoothness of the grain. The mask keepers wore their own wooden masks in honor of this one, the crown mask of the High Elder, leader of the temple elders who ruled Ahiranya's faith and now ruled Ahiranya itself. It was carved from sacred wood and imbued with Yaksa-born magic. The power in it was so strong that touching it would make skin blister and burn. Pressed to flesh long enough, it could eat away down to the bone. But Bhumika was thrice born, with the deathless waters running through her veins. She had nothing to fear. She could not be hurt by sacred wood. The crown mask filled her flesh with warmth that made her blood sing, and when she raised it up, pressing it to her own face, it settled against her skin, pouring its gifts through her. She felt Ahiranya around her, felt the rolling expanse of it, all the green, every thorn she had raised from the earth, every trap she had set, every flowering thing that watched the roads and pathways through the city for her with her own eyes, waiting for imperial soldiers to dare darken Ahiranya's borders again. Come, she thought, and my sister and I will deal with you again. Come if you like, Ahiranya is waiting for you. She walked to the Hirana with a handful of mask keepers. The worshippers, waiting at the base, parted around her with a sigh. She held her masked face high and set her feet against the first steps. The stone knew her, welcomed her. As she walked, the Hirana carried her like a gentle wave, up to the entrance, into the corridors of the temple. For many of the years the regent had ruled Ahiranya, the temple had been in ruin, fire damage, marked with the ash and flame that had killed so many of Bhumika's temple siblings and her elders. The statues of the Yaksa in the shrine rooms had been destroyed. The paintings and carvings on the walls had faded or been carefully obliterated. But Bhumika was High Elder now, and her regent husband was dead. She entered one of the shrine rooms and was struck again anew by how much had changed. Now the floor was swathed in a large mat of pale rose. There were lanterns hung upon the ceiling, delicate glass things that filled the room with soft, welcoming light. The walls were no longer stained and empty, but marked with dozens of alcoves, each filled with a statue of a Yaksa. The Yaksa had once been innumerable. Once every village, every family had their own shrine and their own effigies, their own tales of the Age of Flowers. Artisans, carefully chosen by Bhumika herself, had tried to craft likenesses of as many of them as possible. Bhumika was surrounded by eyes of flowers and hands shaped like the fronds of drooping leaves, skin patterned like seeds or bark whirl, bodies carved in frozen motion that whirled like vines. She reached for her mask, prying it from her face. The cool air touched her skin, and the scent of incense filled her nose, her throat. She breathed it in. She heard the light motion of footsteps behind her. "Are you ready to meet the worshippers, Elder Bhumika?" a mask keeper asked. Was she? She bowed in worship to the Yaksa to give herself a moment's reprieve. The effigies stared back at her, inhuman and beautiful, painted gold and green and blood-rich red, with their eyes gleaming in the lantern light. The worshippers would bow at her feet as she bowed now, and make offerings for the Yaksa. They would weep or smile and ask her for miracles, or thank her for existing, as if her rise were a miracle enough for them. It filled her with disquiet. She could not help it. All they want are the blessings of the Yaksa, she reminded herself sternly. All they want is to see me and believe that Ahiranya has a greater fate lying before it. This desire, this dream, was part of the fragile weft keeping Ahiranya whole. Whatever Ahiranya had suffered, its people had gained this. Their faith returned. Their mantras and myths given life, temple elders and deathless waters, and hope. "I'm ready," she said. "I'll greet them in the Triveni, guide them there." There was a murmur of agreement, and the mask keeper vanished. Bhumika searched in her heart for the things she understood to be the bones of faith, the quiet, lingering hope of a tale of Yaksa, the gleaming rush of power that her own magic filled her with, the memories of kneeling with her temple siblings and feeling like part of a greater whole, as if in worship there could be a future. Her faith, like her temple siblings, was a great ghost, a shadowy thing that fluttered in her head and heart, half remembered. She held the wisps of it tightly, forcing herself to feel it. If her brother were alive, he'd laugh at her. He'd always believed in great dreams, in the Ahiranya that could never be. Now Bhumika had no choice but to do the same. In the mornings, Padma liked to attempt to toddle at top speed while screaming at the top of her lungs. Unfortunately, she could not yet walk without clinging on tightly to the nearest surface, so her efforts were in vain and often ended in tears and bruised knees. Because she could not wreak the havoc she desired unaided on her chubby year-old legs, Bhumika often facilitated her efforts, holding Padma carefully beneath the arms, steadying her shaky steps on the ground. Bhumika didn't run, of course. She didn't need to. "My legs are much longer than your own," she said to Padma as her daughter careened on the spot in Bhumika's arms. "But I am happy to help you run." She went on with false solemnity as Padma burped and tried to fling herself headfirst onto the marble floor. "Practice hard enough, and I'm sure you'll outrun us all one day." After leaving the Hirana, Bhumika had immediately changed into a more familiar, colorful sari and wrapped her mask away. Then she had gone to find her child. That morning, Padma had been with one of the older maids, who handed her over gratefully. "She is a handful, elder," the woman had said. "I know," Bhumika had replied, trying not to sound too proud. Bhumika had never thought she'd be the kind of woman who would play with a child like this. As the wife of the governor of Ahiranya, she had known she would be required to uphold a certain image. Holding children was all well and good, but running with them, chasing them like a maidservant, that would have been unacceptable for a woman of her status. But she was not the governor's wife any longer. She was free. Around them, light poured into the mahal, through the open windows framed by flowers, and the cracks in the walls, and the roof that had not yet been repaired, and perhaps never would be. Bhumika could feel every curling vine and trembling petal, a low-level awareness that hummed in her blood. But she ignored it for now as she spoke to Padma and laughed with her and occasionally offered the mahal dwellers who walked by her a nod of acknowledgement. Jivan found her, eventually. "My lady," he said, bowing appropriately. His face was set in its usual forbidding lines, angular and tense, his mouth firm. Then he looked at Padma, who was flailing extremely enthusiastically, and his expression softened into a smile. "May I?" he asked. Bhumika nodded and kneeled down and offered Padma his hands. Bhumika released her daughter and she teetered forward, grasping onto him with an ear-piercing shriek of what Bhumika could only assume was happiness. He held Padma steadily, his eyes on her, and said, "Lord Chitan is waiting for you." Chitan was a high-born Ahiranyi. He tried to seek her out at the festival of the Dark of the Moon, full of concerns and questions, and she had diplomatically put him off. Now here he was again, apparently. "Is he?" Bhumika said neutrally. "I didn't request him." "He claimed you had planned to meet." "No." Bhumika pursed her lips. "Kalida has a record of all my arranged meetings." "I haven't seen Kalida this morning, milady." Sometimes she missed the ease with which the household had run before. But now all her servants were also her advisers and her soldiers. All her soldiers were her allies. She did not have the structure and support of an empire to back her rule, as her husband had. Just as her mahal was half broken, held together by luck and magic, so was her government. "I'll find her," Bhumika said. She kneeled down and Jivan nudged Padma until she was clinging to her mother's hands instead. "Have one of the girls serve him refreshments." "My lady," he said, and bowed once more before striding away. Bhumika walked into her own chambers and found Kalida waiting. Kalida looked sweaty, harangued. "The roof came down on one of the rice stores," Kalida said grimly. "Is anyone injured?" Kalida shook her head. "Have any stocks been lost?" "Some," Kalida said shortly, which meant that a handful of servants were still working their way through the wreckage and making an accounting of the damage. Bhumika winced internally. They could not afford to lose any supplies. A hand tugged at her sari. Up! Padma demanded. You're a terror, Bhumika said, with utter fondness, and swept her daughter up into her arms. She kissed Padma's face over and over until Padma shrieked and kicked her little legs furiously. My lady, Kalita said impatiently, hand her to me and go. Bhumika did with one further kiss. It felt good to briefly relish this. The smell of her daughter's hair, the soft riot of her curls, the sheer joyous fury with which she greeted the world. Kalita thought Bhumika overindulged her child. That was fine. That was a mother's prerogative. Let her daughter be a terror, at least for a time. Some believed they could ready a child for the cruelties of the world with punishment and unkindness, callousing the heart before the world could set its knives upon it. But Bhumika was raised a temple child, taught to exercise her softness and weakness, and to face the world with her teeth bared. And still every loss she had experienced had hurt her. Still she carried the scars of her own choices and the choices made by others. She wanted a different path for her daughter. Perhaps all lives became brimful of pain, eventually. Well then, let her daughters start painlessly in joy. Let her have that at least. My apologies for the delay, Bhumika said, sweeping into the room. I was tending to my daughter. Chetan nodded stiffly. He was seated by a low table under a latticed window in the only relatively unscathed receiving room of the mahal. A gouge in the wall had been carefully concealed behind silk curtains. There were perfumed flowers in bowls at intervals across the room, and a single maid holding a plate of delicacies. She remained by the door, eyes lowered demurely, as Bhumika crossed the room and kneeled down across the table from the high-born lord. How old is she now? Chetan asked. Quintessential small talk, but not without purpose. It allowed Bhumika the opportunity to smile and wave over the girl to pour out tea and offer pastries. Chetan accepted the tea, but declined the rest. She has passed her first year, said Bhumika. You have children of your own, don't you? I do, Chetan agreed. 2 boys. The eldest soon will be 14. My congratulations, Bhumika said. It's a fine thing to have your heir near adulthood. For a moment his gaze warmed. Then he visibly remembered himself. It shuddered. He leaned back. In a severe voice he said, If we may begin, Lady Bhumika. I have serious concerns, many serious concerns. They have not been properly addressed by you or your courtiers. Since her courtiers were cooks and maids, not all of whom could read, and a handful of rebels who couldn't be convinced to put down their masks or their knives and engage in anything resembling diplomacy, that was no surprise. I welcome the guidance of Ahiranya's highborn, Bhumika said. I have taken advisors from all the great families. I hold audiences with them regularly, as you must be aware, Lord Chetan. And what a dull business that was, listening to the concerns of each and every highborn representative, the complaints as their income from the pleasure houses dwindled faster and faster with each day. As the war between the would-be empress and the sitting emperor dragged on, every audience more laden with fear as time passed, every suggestion for new sources of profit more wild. But Bhumika could not make money appear out of thin air. She could not make a highborn wealthier when there was no money to be had. She could barely stop Ahiranya's people from starving. I would have your advice too, of course. You have views on the governance of Ahiranya? I do. My views are straightforward, Elder. The highborn of our country were better served under Emperor Chandra. His gaze bored into her. Many of us would rejoin the empire if we could. How did Emperor Chandra better serve the needs of my fellow highborn? Bhumika asked immediately. No, do not scowl at me, Lord Chetan. I am asking. Tell me. Elder Bhumika, you and your temple council are well aware that we struggle for food, for grain, for rice, for meat. Ahiranya has struggled for many years, and my council and I are ensuring that the rot does not spread to further fields. We will have crops enough, Bhumika replied. Trade is dwindling, he retorted immediately. The merchants beyond our borders are frightened of us. Of you, he did not say. Of the power in you. But she heard it. Oh, she heard it. Empress Malini's allies trade with us, Bhumika pointed out, and what a relief it had been when the first Shrungani merchants had arrived. But as Empress Malini had promised they would, in her official message to the temple elders of Ahiranya, I keep my vows, she'd written. Bhumika hoped that would continue to hold true. And even were that to change, Ahiranya must of course learn to rely upon her own strength. These are unpredictable times, Lord Chitan. We have a duty to strive for our self-reliance. His mouth thinned. If I may be so bold, he said. She inclined her head in permission. We have long relied upon the support from the Empire, he said. I, and many of my fellows, are not convinced our country can survive alone. If the elder would consider other forms of diplomacy. Bhumika sipped her tea, set the cup down gently. No one would wed me now, Lord Chitan, she said. My fellow elders would not be a suitable prospect either. I did not mean, did you not? Forgive me, I am not sure what other avenues of diplomacy are available to us, she said evenly. I could, of course, plead for mercy for Ahiranya and lay down my life, but Emperor Chandra would still visit punishment upon us. I do not mean to be combative, of course, Lord Chitan. Bhumika went on, allowing her voice to soften. But the Emperor is not a kind man or a forgiving one. We are lucky that he has been so thoroughly distracted by rebellion and upheaval in his own empire, or Ahiranya's borders would be swarming with even more Parijatvipan soldiers than they already are. As it is, my sister and I have dealt with enough of them to know that the Emperor does not view Ahiranya as a friend. And what became of those men? Chitan asked. Those Parijatvipan soldiers, I have not seen them, and I promise you my guards patrol my estate diligently. Bhumika thought of giving him a demonstration of power, but no. She was trying to maintain a fine balance. She needed intimidation, but not alienated. Loyal, despite all his misgivings, she took another sip of her tea. I skewered them through. I am efficient, Lord Chitan. If you have seen no imperial soldiers, it is because my sister and I have left none alive. I see no way he would not inflict punishment on all of us for that, elder and highborn alike. Chitan said nothing. My lord, your line is ancient, she went on. Your ancestry is almost as illustrious as my own. Since your early youth, when you rose to the head of your family, you have spent a significant portion of your coin on funding rebellion. Many of the mask keepers who serve upon the temple council were aided by you. And you did not think on how we would survive then, she thought with a savageness she did not allow to touch her face, her voice. You merely played at rebellion. You liked the sweetness of the idea and never considered the bitterness that reality would bring. We cannot reclaim the glory we had under the Empire, she said, to soothe his feelings. There had been no real glory, of course, but the Empire had assured the highborn of wealth and security, and now that promise was gone, they were faced with a shadow of the same realities all Ahiranya faced, of hunger and of instability, of an unkind world. It was a shock to them, but they would have to adjust to it. What we have now is hard won, and we will struggle to hold it. Perhaps you think we would be safer and happier under Emperor Chandra, or perhaps you think there is a highborn better suited to the task of ruling Ahiranya, who would step into the place of the council, Lady Bhumika. She raised a hand to stop him. It does not matter, she said. I do not seek to see into your heart. I have the utmost respect for your suffering. I think of what my uncle would have faced had he lived through what befell the city, and I mourn for what you have lost, she said, to remind him of what she had lost. But you need the strength of the temple council, the magic within me and my fellows. If you wish to hold on to what wealth and privilege remains to you, you will remain steadfast in your loyalty to me and mine, and an independent Ahiranya, or everything you love will fall. As you say, he managed. I would, of course, accept the children of our highborn as temple children, she told him. I would never deny my fellow highborn their right to rule alongside the elders, in whatever capacity you choose. But it is a dangerous path, as you know. Better, I think, if we work as allies. Come to the next audience, Lord Chitan. Advise me. Steer our country. Or send me your youngest child if you wish. There are many choices before you. But Chandra is not one of them. She paused long enough to let the words settle, long enough for his jaw to tighten, his eyes to lower, as her words rattled through him and settled into his bones. Now, she said, gesturing over at the maid, compassion stitched into the shape of her mouth and her creased brow, so he would know they were allies still. Have more tea, Lord Chiton, and try this mattia. I promise you they're very good. It was night when Bhumika climbed the Hirana again, pitch dark, nothing but the stars and a faintly silver half-moon to guide her. But the Hirana welcomed her like an old friend. In the daylight with an audience, it had moved like water. Now with the worshippers long gone, the stone merely molded to her feet, this rising a slow, gentle thing. She gazed up as she walked, at the fissures in the rocks and the figures carved upon it. Yaksa stared down at her, their eerie faces glowing under moonlight. Priya was already there, sitting on the plinth at the center of the Triveni. Around her, the Triveni was open to the night, the stars shining on her through the open disk above the plinth, the lights of the city shining up from the velvet dark below. Tell me how it went, Bhumika said by way of greeting. Oh, it was fine. Bhumika pursed her lips. Something had gone wrong then, but she'd have no answers from Priya now. Not without an argument she wasn't in the mood to have. Why don't you walk with me? Bhumika asked instead. Priya slid from the plinth and joined her. Priya was so often gone, patrolling to deal with the imperial soldiers or gather their bodies, traveling across Ahiranya with one of the mask keepers or with Sima or one of Jivan's men, managing the rot in the fields and orchards, or stopping the rot's progress in sickened mortal bodies. But she and Bhumika were never truly apart. They met in the Sangam. Beneath skeins of stars on strange rivers, they spoke to each other, shared truths and tales. They were temple elders, and flesh could no longer limit them. But every time Bhumika saw Priya in person, she was struck by how worn Priya looked. Her skin unevenly sun-darkened, her body in restless motion, her eyes tired but always searching, always rising to track the movement of birds on the horizon or swaying leaves in distant trees. Like Bhumika, Priya could feel the pulse and lifeblood of Ahiranya, every vein of green, every blade of grass, every insect burrowing under the soil. Unlike Bhumika, she seemed to lack any ability, or desire, to ignore it. Even now, with Bhumika maintaining a slow and even pace as they circled the Triveni, Priya was restless. Moving to the edge and back again, seeking magic in the stone around her, the Hirana responded to her eagerly. Maybe I should ask Bilu for some of his hashish, Priya said, carving grooves into the Triveni with her heels. The stone shuddered under the press of her foot, pulsing in time with each swift, thoughtful blink of her eyelids. Maybe it would make me feel calmer. You could just grow your own, Bhumika pointed out dryly. Priya wrinkled her nose. Too much effort. Bhumika rolled her eyes. It would be no effort, and you know it. I don't know why you insist on saying things you don't mean. Next time let me bring some wine with me, and I'll keep quiet. I can smell the wine on you already, Bhumika said dryly. Besides, you need to be able to concentrate, Pri. Oh, you know me, Priya said. She smiled, a kind of reflexive twitch of her lips as she looked at the edges of Ahiranya in the distance. I never let my focus falter. I met with Lord Chiton today, Bhumika said instead of lecturing and told Priya everything. Can't believe you of all people told a highborn that we need to be self-reliant, Priya said with a grin. I don't care for politics particularly, as I am well aware, Bhumika said. But you've always been very, very clear that Ahiranya can't survive alone, and now you've changed your mind? My mind hasn't changed. Bhumika looked over the lip of the Triveni, off at the horizon as Priya had done. I would never have chosen this path, but since we're here, we must make the best of it. And for all the Empress's promises and generosity, we cannot rely on Parijatvipa to trade with us when Parijatvipa is ripping itself apart. There was a certain expression Priya wore sometimes. It came over her most often in the dark of an evening or in the lulls in conversation about the Parijatvipan Empire, its politics, its city-states, its ugly and grinding war. She wore it now. Priya, Bhumika murmured. Priya blinked. That look flitted away, swift as a bird in flight. We have to discuss the mask keepers, said Bhumika. Gannam spoke to me about it again. The deathless waters. The power waiting for them there if they were willing to risk death. The power Bhumika and Priya had. Of course he did. They're getting restless. The ground shifted as Priya rocked back on her heels. Maybe it's time it happens. We can't say no forever. We do not need help, Bhumika said eventually. We can continue to be the only thrice born in the world. Well, we have a good division of labor, Priya said with a shrug. I deal with the fields and the sick and those gangs out in the villages, and you deal with the highborn and the politics. There are a lot of fields, Bhumika said mildly, and a lot of people. There are, Priya agreed. Then she huffed out a sigh, long and slow and achingly tired. There are. I don't know if you want the mask keepers to pass through the waters or not, Bhumika said. You argue in their favor and against them. I'm not arguing, I'm just pointing things out. Maybe I want your view, Bhumika said, a little irritation bleeding into her voice. Maybe I need the advice of my fellow elder. Bhumika, Priya said, do you really want me to advise you? We'll only disagree. If I can take advice from people like Lord Chitan, I think I can stay calm with you. I don't know about that. I can be very annoying when I want to be. Priya. See? Instead of pressing forward into the inevitable argument, Bhumika said, I received another emissary from Shrugna. Did you? This time the Shrugani king had sent one of his minor wives, a shrewd, beautiful woman with fashionably blackened teeth and kohl thick around her eyes, who had shared a fine meal with Bhumika and cooed over her daughter, then laid out the desires of her husband and his council. They're willing to pay us handsomely to have their own fields cleared or saved. Well then, I suppose I'm going to have to learn how to do that, Priya said. She sounded tense. The rot's spreading farther and farther every day, she muttered. It won't be the Shrugani alone who need help soon, I expect. And that could afford us an opportunity. But it isn't one we can take advantage of with you alone to do the work. You understand? I wish, said Priya, that I could cure it. Bhumika, I wish I weren't so slow. You're not slow, Bhumika said. You're trying to attempt the impossible. Priya's forehead wrinkled as she frowned. You don't know that. I know it would be easier if you had help, and I have no time to spare. And nothing like Priya's skill with the delicate work of untangling the rot. I have grown to know Kritika a little better, but you're more familiar with the other mask keepers. What do you think of them? I think they want a better Ahiranya, Priya said. Or at the very least, they want Ahiranya to survive, and they want it to be led by its own people. They're always happy to help me with my work, but I don't know if that makes them trustworthy. They're not trustworthy. You seem to be fast friends with Ganam. That doesn't mean I don't know what he is, Priya said. Spirits, Bhumika, you really think I'd trust anyone? I don't, Bhumika said, but you have put your faith in some interesting people. Priya laughed. I guess I have, and look where it's got us, ruling our own country. Instead of responding, Bhumika paused and pondered, rifling through possibilities. Allowing the mask keepers, the rebels, as they always would be named in the privacy of Bhumika's mind, to have the same sheer power that Bhumika and Priya now possessed, seemed foolhardy at best. But Bhumika had ruminated over the problem, turned it over in her head time and time again, and she could see no alternative. She could not refuse them without civil war, and soil and sky, she and Priya desperately needed their burden lightened. If you really want my view, Priya said slowly, watching Bhumika's face, then I think now that they've become once-born, it's all inevitable. I remember what it was like, craving the waters. They're going to feel that want rolling through them day and night until they get the chance, and that lot have never been afraid of death. No, indeed, Bhumika murmured. Fine, I'll talk to Kritika. We'll do what's needful. Do you ever wonder, Priya said, what it would be like if more of us had survived? If we weren't the only temple children left? No. Yes. Often. Always. I don't allow myself to dwell on it, Bhumika lied. Do you think it would have been easier, all of this? Priya did not remember their siblings as Bhumika did. I think we would not be here, said Bhumika. I think our lives would have been very different. I can't imagine it, and I don't wish to. Sima's told me she'd like to pass through the waters, Priya said, then, cutting through the jumbled weight of Bhumika's own thoughts. And there are others, Bilu, definitely, who'd like to try too. And don't tell me maidservants and cooks aren't fit for it, Bhumika. I'm an ex-maidservant. You were a temple child first. Besides, Priya, don't you want to better for them than this? Would you have chosen this for yourself if there had been another path? Priya went silent at that. Tell me, Priya said eventually, voice softer, how Padma's been. Does she still yell all the time? Yes, because she's still a baby, Bhumika said in her driest tone. Come and see her in the morning if you like. She misses you. Bhumika was finally considering whether it was time to prepare for bed when there was a sharp rap on her chamber doors. Khalida opened them. Jivan strode in. Lady Bhumika, Jivan said with a neat bow. There's a messenger waiting for you urgently. He straightened up. From Empress Malini. Bhumika's heart gave a thud. I'll be there immediately, she said. This time she headed to the receiving room with the appropriate haste. A thin man waited for her. He looked as if he had stumbled from his horse and come to her directly, and smelled like it too. But his bow was polite, his voice respectful when he said, Elder, I have been sent with a message from the Empress herself. A missive written in her own hand. Bhumika took the letter from him. Thank you, she said with much grace as she could muster. If you follow my maid, she'll see to it that you have some sustenance and a comfortable place to rest. The messenger bowed again, murmuring his thanks, and Bhumika began to read. It was a short message. Her hand trembled just slightly as she creased it shut once more. Jivan, she said, turning to the door where her commander waited, gaze alert. Please summon Priya. I need her.